The reading for today is from a WILX report by Chris Walker from June the 12th, 2019, Jackson, Michigan. The number of shootings in Jackson is on the rise. On Tuesday night, the previous night, the City Council passed a resolution to try to stop the violence. Council members agreed to start an intervention program, but Jackson residents say more needs to be done. In 2018, there were 124 shootings that Jackson police responded to. That number is alarming, both to residents and to city leaders. Jackson resident Craig Roney said it's a lot of shootings because there's a lack of opportunities, lack of investment in the community. Hakeem Crampton said, we don't have the necessary things that a community would need to support itself to combat such a vicious cycle that we have in terms of gun violence. The resolution passed will start with an intervention program. Please welcome Jackson Mayor Derek Dobies to tell us about that gun initiative.
Thank you, Ann. You guys have a real treasure with Anita playing the keys, so very beautiful. I composed some words this morning and some thoughts on gun violence as I was drinking my coffee and listening to my daughter scream, run around the room. So apologies if they're a little bit disjointed, but it's nice to be here today surrounded by friends, and more specifically those whose faith allows them to dream about a brighter future for our community, for our city, and those that are inside of it. For years, as Ann mentioned, I worked with members of this congregation on passing the non-discrimination ordinance to protect the LGBT community from discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations. That work has helped us to really define and underscore who we are as a community and what values we have as a community, that we view tolerance and inclusion as highest amongst those values, and that we view diversity as a strength. And since then, whether it's been condemning some of the bigoted remarks of some of the elected officials in Jackson, passing ban-the-box policies for returning citizens, or working to provide subsidized housing for the poor, we've continued to emphasize that simple fact that diversity is a strength for our city. But in the course of that work, we've also come to define how we express those values, how to show that we're a compassionate city. That as leaders, we must work for the least among us, give voice to the voiceless, and stand for those who can't necessarily stand for themselves. In the city of Jackson, there are many, many people who need that support. More than 1 in 3 people live under the federal poverty level in the city of Jackson. Even more are asset limited and income constrained, according to the Jackson County United Way. Our city suffered greatly under the last few decades. Numerous plants have moved elsewhere because of unfair trade policies. 40% of our city population has vanished, and those 33,500 individuals who remained are stuck paying for city infrastructure that was built for 55,000 people, and doing so after a Great Recession. Think about how much strain that causes and how much stress that not only causes for the city, but the people that are living in it. A variety of factors have contributed to the poverty that our community faces, and it's, make no mistake that it's generational poverty. And as we're working to address poverty head-on through our work with the Financial Stability Network, through our Housing First approach, through the Poverty Council I've created, through investing in low-income housing tax credit projects, we're working to make progress on poverty in the city. That poverty stems from a lack of stable, affordable housing, financial literacy, and access to good paying jobs and good opportunities. In short, access to opportunity in the city. That's why I've been going door to door, talking about how we can build a city where we're engaging opportunity for all, making that the mission of our work going forward. And it's why we've taken steps to address the violence that we have in our community. I believe that a big part of the crime and violence that exists within our community is inextricably tied to the poverty that exists in our city. When people lack basic needs, when they lack access to jobs and opportunity, they do what is necessary to survive. When they lack supportive structures at home, when the city is absent in acknowledging them and supporting them, they will look to those support systems in local gangs. And when we lack the will to reach out to those individuals with compassion and purposeful communication to lift them out of that environment, then we cannot be surprised with when their frustration compounds to a point where they feel the only means of communication is to pick up a gun and pull a trigger. I believe that as much as we try to affect change in our environment, we are even more so shaped by it, molded unknowingly or unwillingly by the circumstances in which we're born. To me, every shooting is a cry for help. For too many that are now ensnared in gun violence in our city, I believe this to be the case. The environment in our city has made this problem, and it's not the fault of any one person or singular decision, but it is our responsibility to do the work necessary to fix it. To not only end gun violence, but address the underlying problems of poverty and the problems that are associated with it. As city leaders, we're among the first to get reports of shooting. We hear the stories of the victim, we see the fear of those affected, and understand the damage that such violence can cause in our neighborhoods and the families they support. And in a time when state and federal policy has failed to address gun violence, and that now even permeates into our schools, it is incumbent on local leaders to work to understand the problem and present solutions. And we're doing just that. My State of the City speech earlier this year focused on gun violence, which has been deemed a public health crisis by the American Medical Association and the American Public Health Association. Together with Councilwoman Kelsey Heck, we've been leading a gun violence task force in the city. It's one of the top issues that affects her ward. And since then, we've worked on a dossier of different policy changes, programs and projects to combat gun violence in the city. We've organized a 5-point plan that includes creating early intervention programming, directing private investment, empowering neighborhoods, prioritizing city investment, and strengthening our own internal city policies. And I wanted to take some time this morning to touch on some of those and provide some examples of kind of what we're talking about and what we're doing as a city to address it. First, and as Ann noted, early intervention programming. After we first got elected, we pursued a grant with the Jackson Community Foundation to work with John Jay College out of College of Criminal Justice out of City University in New York to study gun violence in Jackson. And here's what we found. In the last 3 years, anywhere between 50 to 70% of the violence in our city is caused from the behavior of about 120 to 150 individuals. The gunshots that spill into our neighborhoods, the bullets that hit our cars, our homes, and sometimes other people, that violence is derived from 120 to 150 individuals. Think about that. Less than 0.5% of our population is causing 70% of the violence that we see. And John Jay College found that those 120 to 150 individuals involved in the violence are largely associated with group units, whether it be gangs, posses, or other loosely organized family units. Much of the violence that we see here is the spillover from these units fighting back and forth, fighting over drugs, answering insults and injury to each other, and demanding respect by the use of a firearm. Group violence intervention programming is a strategy of crime reduction based on years of research in communities across the country, and the National Network for Safe Communities, the project of John Jay College, works with local law enforcement agencies, social service providers, community activists to reduce that gun violence, improve public safety. The first program of its kind was in the city of Boston. It was actually dubbed the Boston Miracle for its efficacy, and it's continued to roll out in cities like Detroit and Kalamazoo here locally. In essence, what it is intervention programming using various tools to compel those 120 to 150 individuals into a room, engages with them in a compassionate yet firm way, and underscores the consequences of continuing on those paths and the likelihood that they're either going to wind up dead or in prison. The program uses community leaders and influencers to convey those messages, employs service agencies to connect those struggling individuals with the social services they may need to escape from a life of violent crime, access job opportunities, stable and safe housing, mental health services and counseling, or just a solid, reliable community mentor. The National Network for Safe Communities is already working with JPD to conduct an initial problem analysis to identify the resources and stakeholders and active groups and to suggest steps to address that violent crime here within the city. As noted in the reading, Councilman Heck and I proposed increases in funding in the budget for that, and right now we're actually working with some local foundations to help provide more funding for the police department to engage in that critical work. In addition to that investment and those investments from foundations, we're also going to work to drive private investment. While we're working to rebuild our city, and you can see some of the new buildings under construction downtown, it's important that we think strategically about how we can make those new facilities safer for our residents and safer for the communities in which they exist. In early 2017, I helped introduce, and I think it was at the meeting where we passed the non-discrimination ordinance, so I think people might have been a little distracted. But I helped introduce an ordinance that would require certain new commercial buildings to have cameras installed on them to enhance the safety and facilitate police investigation when crime occurs. Project Greenlight is a public-private partnership that began with 9 gas stations in troubled neighborhoods in Detroit. The business owners partnered with Detroit police to share security camera feeds and allow the police to tap into those feeds in real time during emergency situations. This video helps give the police the tools and surveillance they need to proactively fight crime and let people know when there is a gunshot where those people are fleeing to. While our local camera measure failed, I think by a 4-3 vote, I look forward to reintroducing a similar measure in the coming months and working with the business community to stand up a similar program to the Project Greenlight in Detroit, while also respecting the privacy rights of and constitutional rights of individuals and citizens. The trust and cooperation of those citizens is important. And that's why the third component of the work that we're doing is to seek to empower our neighborhoods. I am a firm believer that successful cities have strong, connected, and empowered neighborhood associations. You look to Grand Rapids, Ann Arbor, these other areas that have very vibrant neighborhoods make for very strong cities. They're places where neighbors come together to organize, to undertake beautification projects, share information, keep an eye out for one another's safety and property. In 2016, we went through a master planning process, got input from citizens, and from that feedback, identified 30 potential neighborhood units throughout the city. Working with Council Member Sullivan, I plan to introduce the Neighborhood Association Ordinance so we can encourage residents to formalize those neighborhoods within the city, and in doing so, use that structure to help the city to deliver information faster and more holistically when there's an issue or development that affects the residents within a given neighborhood. It also creates a funding pool so that they can access resources to provide grants when they want to take more control and ownership of some of the problems that they face. Organizing our neighborhoods and giving them the tools necessary to take on some of those localized challenges will build the networks and relationships, most importantly, necessary to navigate the problems and also work to provide information to city police when violence erupts. When we invest in our neighborhoods, we invest in ourselves. And that's why we'll continue to fight crime by prioritizing our city investment as well. And what I mean by that is using city resources and a design in a way to actually reduce crime in the first place. Anyone who knows Frank's Party Store in Jackson up on First Street knows that it was a location where illicit activity congregated. Drugs, prostitution, shootings, and the like. If anyone has driven by there recently, the whole feel of the area has changed. We did this by employing a strategy called crime prevention through environmental design. It relies on manipulating the built environment to create safer neighborhoods. And if you look at the surrounding area around Frank's, you'll see evidence of that. The new intersection with bump outs to slow traffic, raising the tree canopy to improve the line of sight down the street, installing new decorative lighting to not only enhance the beautification of the area but improve visibility, the new plantings and trees, the decorative new fencing to show that people are invested in maintaining this area and are watching. While simple things like urban design don't seem to directly correlate to crime and violence, they do. It's had an impact in more ways than one, and over the next year, we'll continue to investigate other hotspots for crime and make similar enhancements in the neighborhood. We'll also work to strengthen our city policies and the enforcement of those policies. One of the first ordinances I worked to enact back in 2012 was our nuisance abatement ordinance, revisions to our nuisance abatement ordinance. The ordinance allows us to enforce on a property when there's been a growing number of different violations. Think of multiple noise violations, trash violations, domestic disturbances, fights. Allows us to compel the owners to take corrective action to abate those nuisances, and also requires them to pay for associated costs. In other words, if there was a nuisance abatement action filed against a property owner, the city prevailed, the city could obtain a court order to force the property owner to pay for the costs associated with those violations and the cleanup or abatement of them. And they're not specific, those fines aren't specific to a different specific department. A property owner in violation of that ordinance could be ordered to pay for the number of times that the police have been called to a specific location. For housing inspections, the cost of cleanup, and the like. In 2012, we actually reduced that number of violations that would qualify a property as a nuisance and included the unlawful discharge of a firearm as a nuisance. I believe in the coming year we'll increase the use of this tool to curb that violence, and specifically gun violence, on the number of properties in our community that have unfortunately become havens for this type of activity. The properties that harbor violent offenders should either help find a solution or pay the costs associated with the city's consistent response. Taxpayers shouldn't keep fronting the bill on that alone, as it drains critical police resources. And we need those property owners to step up and be part of the solution. So, look, these are just a few examples of the steps we're taking to address gun violence that's been plaguing our city. We'll continue to address gun violence by these methods and others, but we can't do it without the moral support and collective action of people like you. There is a direct relationship between social action and evangelism. True worship is to work for justice and care about the poor and oppressed, and when people of faith put that faith into action, there is no limit to the good work that can be done. Proactively addressing the cause of the risky criminal behavior of these folks and working to change that behavior will allow us to lower crime, reduce the violence, minimize the arrests and the incarceration, and help us improve the trust and transparency between the community and the law enforcement. Far too many of our young people end up dead or in prison, and we need to fundamentally shift the way that we think about violence and offenders and policing. So, I think it's important for us to truly understand and embrace what those who engage in gun violence truly are. I think that they're just lost. I always say that you can judge a community by how it treats its most vulnerable citizens. And I think that instead of turning our backs on those who are engaging in this activity, we can turn towards them. To open our hearts and treat them with the compassion that they need to put down their weapons and not only improve their lives, but improve the city and the neighborhoods in which they live. So, thank you for allowing me to be here today and to share a few thoughts on what we can do to create peace in our city. Thanks.